Hello, I'm Tim Rogers. You are watching Kotaku.com, Game of the Decade Edition. It's that time of the decade again, the end of it. Seeing as the mysteries of the universe conspired 3 years ago to begin depositing money into my bank account twice monthly in exchange for my once weekly histrionic microphone performance of my opinions regarding interactive electronic animated picture contests, I'd feel like a criminal rube if I did not regale you with my selections for the games of the decade. If we're going to choose a number of pieces of media to describe a decade, we might as well choose 10. Choosing more than 10 feels like bad taste. How can we choose just 10 works to summarize a decade? I feel like answering this question constitutes a slightly more interesting exercise than actually explaining my choices for the 10 best games of the decade. As I sat and prepared to compose my list, sentimentality and scientific interest contended for my attention. I wondered, should I simply choose the 10 games I liked the most, which happened to possess release date timestamps between midnight on January 1st, 2010 and 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 2019? Or should I warm up my microscope and calculatedly discern the 10 games that quote-unquote defined this decade? Do I make this list for me, or do I make this list for you? I care about you a lot, though my doctor says I need to care about myself too, so let's make this list a mixture of me and you. Furthermore, I've seen a lot of decades. I have just now entered the 5th decade of my life. I know that decades sprawl nebulously. By the time you're halfway through your 30s, you might start thinking in and speaking of decades. Except these decades don't always begin on a calendar year that ends with a 0, nor do they necessarily begin with a specific relevant moment or situate with that relevant moment exactly in the middle. You sift out your memory from time to time and gaze upon chunks of years, and sometimes those chunks are 10 years. We're all humans. I know something you don't. You know something I don't. The importance and heft of our individual and collective subjective experiences far outweigh any brazenly idiotic numerological exercise such as defining the best games of the decade. So, having osmosed much sentimentality, scientificity, and philosophy over the course of the first 4 decades of my own life, knowing myself too well, I ultimately decided that to compose this list, I would need to do it fast. I would need to draw hard lines. I knew that if I dwelled too long on the composition of this list, I would begin a vortex spiral of reverie all the way back to my perfect life at the start of 2010. I was engaged. I was living in a 6-bedroom house. My band was playing bigger and bigger venues. It's been long enough since that time that I can confess right now that yes, my band was bad on purpose, and I was not being defensive when I said that back then. Nor was I being quote-unquote ironic when I said that I liked the bad music that we were making. I like dumb stuff, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore. As of January 2010, I was working as a full-time game designer at a AAA video game studio. 6 months later, I was penniless on a beach on the north shore of Oahu. I guess there are worse places to be penniless. 5 months later, I was well, you can see what I mean about why I shouldn't dwell on this too long. If you would like to hear a more sentimental, anecdotal take on my decade in video games, 2010 through 2019, just check out the Thursday, December 12th, 2019 episode of the Bad End podcast, and you can hear me talk a lot about my video game industry experience in the 2010s. In order to compose my personal list of the best video games of the 2010s decade, I began by shutting myself in my bedroom and turning out the lights. I laid in my bed in the dark. I put earbuds into my ears. I set up a 60-minute critical thinking program on my favorite binaural beats app. I put on an eye mask and spent exactly 60 minutes in my mind palace. The way I wrote this and the way I'm reading it make it sound like some sort of elaborate joke, though. I mean, it's actually not that weird to just lay down in the dark and think about something away from your laptop or notes or paper or whatever. Just try to see how much you can think of. I challenged myself to think of as many 2010s games as I could in that 1 hour in my mind palace. Dozens of game experiences floated up before me. Mostly I saw flickers of gameplay, though in consideration for my chronic headache-suffering future self who has to edit this, let's pretend the games occurred to me as a parade of box arts. With each flicker of gameplay, I remembered moments in my life. I remembered smells, tastes. I remembered temperatures of pleasant breezes. I remembered people and conversations. When the binaural beats program ended, I gingerly sat before my laptop and typed out the names of 29 games. I performed a quick Wikipedia fact-checking to make sure that all of those games had actually been released during the 2010s. Of course, this fact-checking was unnecessary because I had used my mind palace. You'd think that by now I would have learned to trust my mind palace. I had gotten 29 of 29 right. Before beginning to prune my list of 29 games down to a list of 10 games, I scheduled a tweet for 10:31 p.m. on Sunday, December 8th, 2019. I would have scheduled that tweet for 10:08 p.m., though I knew for a fact that my most devoted haters would view that timestamp with suspicion. In my tweet, I asked you, the prospective viewer, to presuppose the entries on my list. I did this as a temperance exercise, so that by the time you started tweeting at me with games you had assumed I had considered, I would have already finished composing a list, writing a script, reading that script into a microphone, and editing this video that you're about to watch. The fact is, the 2010s were the worst decade of my life. And that's saying something because the 1990s literally involved me attending a high school. By asking you to tweet game names at me long after it was too late for me to go back and change my list, I would be begging for a pain that enriched my own private reflection on this heckish decade. I will keep that reflection to myself and to the listeners of the Thursday, December 12th, 2019 episode of the Bad End podcast. Now, with the tweet destined to launch in 48 hours, bittersweetedly aware of impending regret, I began my reverie. First, I needed to prune my list of 29 games down to 10 games using a scalpel made of science. I allotted myself 10 minutes for this task. When considering games of the decade, would I pick games that pioneered trends? Or would I pick the games that best embodied said trends, whether they originated them or not? Would I allow myself to pick games that did not commit any innovation at all and instead revised established genres? Games that eschewed all zeitgeist in favor of the old ways? Most importantly, would I prioritize games that best represented this decade? Or would I select games that I predict will exact the most influence over the decades to come? Would I play the role of historian or prophet? I had allotted myself only 10 minutes for the task of selecting my 10 games, so that I might not dwell too hard on the rules that defined a game, quote-unquote, of the decade. Rather than philosophize into the void or argue endlessly with the abyss of myself, I would use the science in my heart. I gritted my teeth and I ripped that decade off like a band-aid. 1 minute before the 10-minute timer went off, I was staring at my list of 10 games. In that one silent minute, I decided on an ironclad rule. I would not change the list. Next, I set about writing justifications for every game's place on the list. This would be the hard part. I could definitely write 30,000 words about any given game on this list off the top of my head. I could make a 3-hour in-depth review video of any of these games. At this exact point in my life, I promise you that I know myself well enough to know that if I did not impose rigid structures on everything I do professionally, I would have died of starvation in March of 2012. Were it not for my rigid outlining discipline, I would have written 3-hour scripts for each of the 29 games on my initial list. You, the viewers, sometimes comment that my videos are long, though here let me promise you, were it not for my overflowing discipline, on this occasion, you'd be sitting down to watch an 87-hour video right now. Instead, knowing that my lecture speaking voice covers approximately 150 words per minute, I limited myself to maintain an average of 400 words per game on this list. So that I could manufacture some sort of prosaic flow, I would write the segments in the order you see them in this video. In the spirit of the 2010s' zeitgeisty roguelikishness, I implemented a genie system. The genie system is a secret weapon of my own invention that I have long employed when writing the fiction that I never publish. It goes like this. Once I write an outline, that outline is set in stone. However, when writing the actual text, I am allowed 3 wishes. I can change up to 3 items from the outline, no more. Wow, it's almost like writing a script for a video about my favorite games of the decade is itself one of my favorite games of the decade. That didn't feel like quite enough restriction, so I then, slightly in the spirit of the 2010s zeitgeist of live-streamed, off-the-cuff, genuine personality, I limited myself to spending no more than exactly 10 minutes writing each blurb. This required me to compose just 40 words of polished prose per minute. I can type 40 words per minute on a Victorian-era typewriter. That's actually true. We don't need to talk about that. So I knew it would be easier than taking a dump on this Philco Majestouch 2. 10 minutes per 400 words would allow me time for 2 drafts and 2 revision passes to get each segment under the word count. So now I let my fingers tap dance all over my Philco Majestouch 2 keyboard. In a way, ain't haste the ultimate honesty? If a game don't brain gush enough joy juice during a type frenzy on some sweet cherry browns, can we truly call its memory felt? I don't know, man. Let's get this video in the coffin already. Here we go. Number 10. Destiny. Developers at Bungie, who were fans of the game I had been developing, sent me a pre-release code for Destiny. I plunked around in it lonelily for many days, imagining the thrill of playing it with friends. On the day the game released to the public, I was waiting for a friend to get online when a kid called to inquire about buying my car. I needed to sell my car so that I could pay my rent because the game I was developing, the game some Destiny developers had liked, had cost me all of my money. The kid came to look at my car. He brought his dad and cash. I sold my 2007 Mazda 3 sedan to a teenager while playing Destiny on its release date. Because I was living in Oakland, California at the time, I sold it at a profit. That night, I played Destiny Strikes with several game designer friends. Many of us were jaded freelance Zynga veterans. The power of the service game, ton of bricks us. Not quite single player, not quite an MMO. On the 15th anniversary of the launch of the Sega Dreamcast, Destiny was Phantasy Star Online reborn. Destiny was American Monster Hunter. Destiny gave me 5-minute goals, 10-minute goals, 20-minute strikes, and 30-minute campaign set pieces. I could pick Destiny up and while away a minute at a time grinding on patrol while listening into conference calls on a single earbud. Destiny was Dragon Quest with guns where the party members were my real-life game designer friends. Loudly we yelled MOBA lingo about aggroing such and such boss. Our experiences in genres elsewhere carried us. In addition to its bigness and its expensiveness, here was a pristinely designed video game. Yet a phantom menace loomed. Behind Destiny's gregarious generosity, other publishers spectated, coldly considering calculating criminal trespasses in future similar products. Destiny might not have had loot boxes itself, though I know for sad fact that its myriad elegant game design solutions trickled into the think tanks that weaponized those behavioral psychology abominations that dominated discourse later in the decade. And number 9, Super Mario Maker 2. On September 11th, 2015, I was in the middle of finishing the development of my online cross-platform competitive multiplayer video game for the first time. I had no clue we would have to finish it again. I drove over to Target in the 1999 Nissan Altima some of my ex-Zynga game developer friends had left at my house before they accidentally moved to Thailand. I bought Super Mario Maker. I took it home. I made one level. I joked to my girlfriend that it felt too much like my job. I played some other players' levels. I joked to my girlfriend that these other players probably didn't have the same job as me. Soon I stumbled upon a simple, rustic level of pleasant graphical presentation and hangoutable flow. I thought, if you give it enough time, this game's gonna be full of levels this good. Eventually, I was right. Though also, Mario Maker's cup soon runneth the heck over with excruciating Kaizo meat grinder levels. In perfect synchronization with the advent of Twitch.tv as certifiable mainstream culture, virtuosic performance at ice-cold, deadly Mario levels became an art form unto itself. After years in the shadows of the hacking community, superstars now emerged to entertain a legion of spectators, all of whom could look at the screen and immediately know that they are not good enough to do that. This worked as well as it did because way more than enough game likers have played a Mario game. Mario Maker thus made Mario a sport. That sport made Grand Pooh Bear Red Bull Esports' golden boy. I spent hundreds of hours playing other players' levels and hundreds more crafting my own elaborate Mario playgrounds in Super Mario Maker 1. I experienced many sandboxes of my own joy and the joy of others. I haven't looked at other Games of the Decade lists yet, though I'm sure a lot of critics are going to put Minecraft on there. No way, buddy. Minecraft sure did light the zeitgeist candle on user-generated game content. Mario Maker, however, owns it. For example, Towerfall developer Matt Thorson made Mario Maker levels before going on to make my pick for 2018 Game of the Year, Celeste. How many Minecraft house builders have gone on to make a game that I consider Game of the Year? Mario Maker 2 is Mario Maker, except better, fuller, richer. Mario Maker 2 replaced Mario Maker 1. Also, it's on the Nintendo Switch, and the Nintendo Switch is the console of the decade. I baited Red Bull Esports' golden boy Grand Pooh Bear with a Twitter DM. I asked him for his favorite game of the decade. He replied that Mario Maker 1 and 2 would be too obvious. He said his game of the decade would be Spelunky HD. What this tells me is that Grand Pooh Bear is so sharply talented at predicting and then navigating heck gauntlets crafted by other human minds that he more appreciates these sinister challenges calculated by a computer. I should have known that Grand Pooh Bear's legendary reflexes would never let him take such basic bait. Number 8. Flappy Bird. Social media was younger, politics were not yet quite so screamy. Something in the air in spring of 2013 inclined the average free-time-having Earth person to enjoy being beat up by a video game. Flappy Bird took over social media for a period of many loud weeks, during which opinions, which we had yet to ubiquitously begin abbreviating as takes, oscillated between "beat my score" and "this game sucks." And Flappy Bird did suck. More than any game worthy of this list has the right to, honestly. Its suckage doesn't matter. I played it and I loved every floppy second of it. That's because my friends also played it. Flappy Bird offered the opportunity for me to finally play a video game as a bandwagoner and not as a tastemaker. It reminded me of a lecture Bennett Fadi had given about his Game of the 2000s decade runner-up, QWOP. Fadi had said, frequent fail states should be funny. In QWOP, failure is funny because that protagonist sure is a basket of noodles. In Flappy Bird, the humor requires deep flickers of introspection, which enhances its potency. Death in Flappy Bird is hilarious because the game's single input induces the character to perform a physical action of such transient ephemerality, preceding a nosedive of an unpredictable trajectory, muscle memorizable only to the most philosophical of Herculeses. On top of this, the game's collision is too honest. Usually in an action game, the player character's hitbox is significantly smaller than their graphics. The never put an easy mode into Dark Souls crowd would spontaneously combust if they knew 1% of the lies action games perpetrate that I know. In Flappy Bird, the hitbox is exactly the size of the character. This makes death fast, cheap, and eventually predictable if its ridiculousness enthralls you long enough for you to get good. Flappy Bird became a meme unto itself during a year when elementary school students did not yet speak the word meme. In 2013, Flappy Bird amplified the message of Anna Anthropy's 2012 book, Rise of the Video Game Zinesters, that anyone could make a video game. Eventually, everyone on social media and their little sister knew that Flappy Bird was making $50,000 a day on ad revenue. So not only could anyone make video games, anyone could get rich off of them. Or so many enterprising entrepreneurs in the San Francisco Bay Area wanted to believe when they came asking me if I could make them something like Flappy Bird. Buddy, I said, I bet the guy who made Flappy Bird couldn't make you something like Flappy Bird. He eventually released Swing Copters, which was genuinely great. On the other hand, I was still right. right. The entrepreneurs paid me anyway. Not quite 50 grand a day, though it paid the bills for a couple months. Here's number 7. Overwatch. Overwatch stands in on this list for all of Blizzard's work during the 2010s decade. That's not a cop-out. I believe Overwatch stands in as a work unto itself for all of Blizzard's work, period. It is their crowning achievement. In the first year of the 2010s, Blizzard gave us StarCraft II: Wings of Liberty, a game that drilled down into strictly specific design criteria of the real-time strategy genre. The efforts of StarCraft II's designers would clarify the visions of esports designers, crystallizing the MOBA which powered the heart of the Twitch.tv zeitgeist. With Diablo III, Blizzard flexed their expertise in presenting tactile action. With Hearthstone, they perpetrated a crystalline act of pure game design. With Heroes of the Storm, they looked at the MOBAs that had looked at StarCraft II, then they made a better one, though I guess nobody cares as much about a better MOBA as they do about a popular MOBA. Overwatch, meanwhile, brings it all together. Overwatch is a genre-fluid, multidisciplinary renaissance game. It's a team-based first-person shooter. Its characters are ostensibly MOBA heroes, making the team composition metagame as layered as that of any collectible card game. Its aesthetic borrows lovingly from classic games such as Street Fighter. Overwatch is cooperative deck building, dovetailing into competitive first-person shooter basketball action. Overwatch shows the power of diversity and flexibility, both of game genre and of team composition. It teaches players to complement one another. At the time Overwatch came out, I was preparing to publish my own team-based online multiplayer game and already beginning to feel deep fear that we'd be blasted into irrelevance by game developers huger than us before we could get ours out the door. Overwatch, together with Rocket League, showed us that more genres than just MOBA, shooters, and fighting games could fit under the competitive games umbrella. Number 6, it's a tie between The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3. I'm invoking the genie rule for the first time. Here's my first wish. I want to allow a tie. Now let me confess, I have not completed The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild or The Witcher 3. In fact, I haven't played either of them long enough to even have any idea which one I will probably ultimately love more. I'm pretty sure it'd be The Witcher 3, though pretty sure is not good enough for the purposes of this very scientific list. Without playing more than half of either of these games, I can confidently state that Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3 are two absolutely perfect video games for exactly me. And I think 6th place on a top 10 list is the perfect place to exert my utmost selfishness. I can already hear a particular type of commenter cracking his knuckles. Look, buddy, yes, I can decide a game is one of the best games I've ever played without finishing it. I am 40 goddarn years old. I have played literally thousands of video games. And while sometimes a game that starts strong middles poorly and ends disastrously, though sometimes even I experience critical surprises, I know myself and video games well enough to know that these two games are perfect. I don't believe in backlogs. I have accepted that I own video games I will never play. Also, as a former advertising industry professional, I have developed an ironclad immunity to pre-release hype. When you're still thinking at least once weekly about a video game you've been wanting to play for 5 years, that's how you know it's good. And I think I've gotten pretty good at identifying when a game is going to be that kind of game for me, so let me just say that that's The Witcher 3 and Breath of the Wild. Also, I've played every other Zelda, and I've played every other Witcher game, and I've even read all of the Witcher books. Also, I've played all the way through Red Dead Redemption 2 and loved every second of it. I loved its hyper-authentic cowboy dialogue. I loved its huge, slow pace and its plotting logistics. In a decade of yearly, factory-farmed, defamiliarized AAA Zelda-likes such as Assassin's Creed and Watch Dogs, the presence of these two bombastically enormous, fruitcake-dense, progressively designed modern sword guy adventures warms my heart to explosion temperature. I went way off the script for a bit in that part about backlogs, so that doesn't count toward my word count average, just in case you're keeping score at home. And number 5, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. In one of the first videos I ever made for Kotaku.com, I asserted that PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was the game of the decade. I have not changed my mind. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is the game of the decade, by way of scientific fact. Due to a cocktail of sentimentality and prosaic fanciness so mysterious its exact nature is a mystery even to me, it winds up at number 5 on this, my personal list. Usually right about now I would say I don't make the rules, though in this case I did make the rules and my rules led me here. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds' video game industry significance is manifold. First of all, this is the decade where we got used to basically seeing Xbox Live gamer tags on the evening news. Why not have one in the name of a game? I mean, why stop there? Get this guy a line of canned soup. PUBG, as they call it, started as a mod of an existing game, Arma 3. To put it briefly, this mod gave some players exactly what they wanted: slightly less survival logisticality and a whole lot more fast-paced ownage. Perhaps silently, a rune-encrusted stone deep within the bedrock of the game-liker mentality has thrummed with a wish since time immemorial. The wish for a 100-player battle royale. With so many players queuing up to kill one another, the game is practically procedural. Human behavior is the roguelike. Human psychology is the darkest soul. This is a very 2010s video game origin story. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds' shocking popularity presented its maker the fateful choice between going home or going big. He went big. The resulting game solidified the battle royale genre with such a deafening sonic boom ripping across Twitch and YouTube that Epic immediately turned their proverbial cruise ship clockwise and steered their vagabond game Fortnite toward Party Island. Fortnite quickly became the biggest game in the world and the certifiable biggest game of the decade. Let's not mince words. It did this by painting PUBG with a Halloween store dumpster diving wardrobe, and also by being free, and also by having quote-unquote dances. Its shooting is good, its building is bad. It has persistent in-game environmental storytelling. It has unfinished menus. Fortnite is the 2010s in video games. Heck, Fortnite is also the 2010s in politics, social media, and mainstream entertainment. And Fortnite will be the 2020s in video games. Fortnite deserves to be the game of the decade instead of PUBG. Well, I'm going to take a stand and root for the underdog, because this is my list. While we're on the subject of a dog that is under something, number 4, Getting Over It with Bennett Fadi. My friend Bennett Fadi made this video game about a man in a pot trying to climb a mountain of trash using only a Yosemite hammer. It is not a sledgehammer. During the game, Bennett Fadi himself provides a pseudo-inspirational lecture in voiceover about the nobility of failure. I say pseudo-inspirational because it's likely he's just trying to make you mad. Also, he regales you with the history of a video game called Sexy Hiking. Getting Over It with Bennett Fadi arrived a post-Flappy Bird meme, in a year when even kindergartners knew the word meme. Sublime in its flow, cold in its style, utterly honest in its ridiculousness, hilarious especially during its disasters. It inspired many years' worth of screaming YouTuber video footage compilations. Getting Over It with Bennett Fadi shows video game likers wrestling with themselves. If Bennett Fadi's favorite game of all time, the cup and ball, were a person, it would be proud of the utterly palpable let-me-try-that-ishness of its godchild Bennett Fadi's achievement. If anyone objects to me putting my friend's game on this list, by the way, buddy, I became friends with Bennett Fadi because I liked Quap, and because I thought I could leech talent off of him. It ain't worked yet, though. Here comes another decade, I guess. Now that we're over something, let's, number 3, Undertale. I met Toby Fox at the 2014 Penny Arcade Expo. He later tweeted about beating me at my own game. I didn't even bother replying that if I'd lost, it was definitely because my teammate was some random deadbeat, and because his teammate was probably Michael Kerwin, the lead programmer of the game. Now, 5.5 years later, I would like to apologize and say I was having a bad weekend. It's hard to have a good weekend at the Penny Arcade Expo when you're demonstrating a deceptively complex and thus difficult to explain 2-on-2 multiplayer abstract sports game. For 10 hours a day all by yourself in a booth with no one else to teach people how to play while you hike to the bathroom. I had seen his game on the internet, though I hadn't given it too much thought aside from I like the colors. Eventually, so many people had recommended Undertale to me that I decided to play it. My good friend Alex Jaffe, wanting nothing more apparently than to watch me stream all the way through the game, gifted it to me on Steam. I streamed it on Thanksgiving Day 2015. For several consecutive Thanksgivings in my neighborhood in Oakland, California, I indulged in a private tradition of fasting. I ate no food and drank no liquid, even water, for 24 hours. On the day I first streamed Undertale, I was already feeling special stress from a crunchy period late in the development of my own game. That stress and the dehydration combined to deflate my brain lining. My skull squeezed into itself. Tight hat-wearing feeling, I plunged into Undertale. Despite my best efforts to remain a pacifist, I accidentally killed Goat Mom. To say I had begun the exercise in a state would tantamount criminal understatement. Accidentally homicidalizing Goat Mom pushed me into a lake of my own making. Ultimately, I had to cut my stream short because the police called to say they'd found my stolen car, a 2007 Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor my friend had left me before moving to Portland. On the one hand, that car had been free. On the other hand, that car ended up costing me about $4,000. I picked up Undertale later. I played through it on my Twitch channel. You can view the entire playthrough on YouTube if you feel like it. Beneath the surface of Undertale, the morsely fossils of the ancient greatness of all old video games sleep. Sometimes loud and always warm, Undertale greeted me like a best friend. Possessing the best video game soundtrack of the decade and perpetrating every fourth-wall-hugging magic trick video games have crouched sharpening since the antiquity of Earthbound, Undertale breathes with the simultaneous palpable exuberance of a YouTube video and the collected maturity of a professional poker player. Moments of sheer emotional honesty stud its cartoon exterior. Entertainment experiences so lush with feelings seldom exist in this world, and when they do, they often annoy persons less open to themselves. Undertale is thus perhaps the only game that can summarize this decade in which many teenagers decided that being good, open-minded, and compassionate was, in fact, pretty cool. Going off the script here for a second to say that what I wouldn't let myself type in this script is that Undertale made me feel like a slob and a jerk and a loser for never trying to make my own video game that was as lush and big and full of stuff as that, and I've always wanted to, and when I did make my own game, it was this extremely sterile, geometrical, preschool industrial, clinical, scientific engineering instrument of a thing. I've been writing short stories and novels since I was a teenager. I've written over 100 novels, and I don't show them to anybody anymore. I haven't shown anyone a piece of my fiction since literally 2003, though I continue to wake up every morning at 4 a.m. and spend about an hour writing, and then I don't show it to anybody. And I've just spent the last almost 3 years coming in here to this office every day and editing videos, staying late, not because anyone at the office expects me to. I stay late and edit videos for myself because I want to make something. I want to make stuff, and I want to fill my stuff with stuff, and I want to try to put something real in there, and then I keep not putting anything real in there, and I keep just putting on like some dumb, like cartoonish, over-the-top, like lecture voice, and I just feel like a jerk, and I feel like an insincere, ungenuine person, like all the time, and a game like Undertale just made me feel like, you know, you can kind of be a funny weirdo and also have so much of this genuine heart in there. And, oops, bumped the microphone there. Yeah, you know. You know what I'm talking about. Let's go on to the next one. I've got number 2. Killer Queen. I first learned of Killer Queen 2 weeks before securing publisher funding for my own competitive multiplayer game. I encountered it in the form of a YouTube video of raw gameplay footage. I watched 1 minute of that footage, during which I perfectly understood every piece of the game's design. 2 teams of 5 players each contend on a single-screen arena at a pixel sport with 3 victory conditions. Number 1. Fill all the hive holes with pollen. Number 2. Assassinate the other team's queen 3 times. Number 3, ride a snail into a hockey goal on your team's side of the arena. Each team has 4 workers and 1 queen. Queens can fly and kill. Workers can upgrade themselves at upgrade stations, at which point they gain the ability to kill at the cost of their pollen-gathering powers. The trinity of win conditions, combined with the omni-availability of all pertinent game status information, transforms the game until it transcends its obvious influences. Killer Queen is a game about looking at the screen. It is a game about looking in the right place at the right time. You can lose a game of Killer Queen exactly because you thought you were about to win. Killer Queen turns spectators into valuable players. A sudden crowd yell about the snail might snap a would-be champion back to their clutch senses. At the 2016 Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, California, I performed a 30-minute lecture on the subject of designing the hypothetical quote-unquote perfect sport. In this lecture, I closely detailed the design process of my own game before revealing the sudden twist that Killer Queen, in fact, was the perfect sport. Having regularly played the game with screaming crowds and sometimes reliable teammates at every opportunity these past 6 years, I still believe this. Killer Queen is the absolute best of the mid-2010s local competitive multiplayer independent game trend. Experiences with games like Samurai Gun, Towerfall, and Nidhogg rejuvenated me and my fellow developers regularly while we developed our own contender. I've heard those sorts of local multiplayer competitive games described as a fad. So thinking about Killer Queen right now, sitting here in front of this microphone, I gotta say, I don't think I have ever played a more nauseatingly stressful video game in my entire life. Online multiplayer and such is one thing. No, man, when people say local competitive multiplayer is where it's at, they are not messing around. So if I can make a wish, not a prediction, a wish about the 2020s, it would be this: that we might all just get off the internet, stop looking at our phones, and start looking at some TV screens and playing some video games of perfectly obviously legible visual presentation with our friends and loved ones. At this point, reveal the sudden twist that my game of the decade was, in fact, the video game I had made, Video Ball. I'm pretty sure someone in the comments would have yelled at me if I'd done that. Yet if I had done that, I would have expected at least a lot of you to understand. I spent 5 years of my life off and on performing calculations to mathematically perfect Video Ball's game design. I spent countless hours in meetings with publishers and potential investors, some of whom smelled like reptile oil, even over the phone. I personally playtested my game with rooms full of 4 players for a counted total of 2,800 hours over the course of the first year alone. I nearly died making Video Ball precisely because I refused to not make my favorite game. I could have gotten a job somewhere and worked on a game that was not my favorite game. Instead, I threw my whole life away to make my favorite game. So don't you dare even think about telling me that I can't call it my game of the decade. If you never played Video Ball, that's okay. If you would like to play it right now, well, you can purchase it on Steam, PlayStation 4, or Xbox One. If you would not like to pay for it, you're in luck, because we just finished developing Video Ball Final Tune Game of the Decade Edition, which is available for free starting today. Video Ball Final Tune Game of the Decade Edition is a pared-down, offline-only version of the original game. In Video Ball Final Tune Game of the Decade Edition, you're limited to just one arena, basic, and just one mode, 2-on-2. We've even added a custom graphical presentation unique to this version of the game. Also, because it's been bothering me for literally 3 years, we went ahead and made one enormous fundamental change to the game design. If you'd like a DRM-free digital download of Video Ball Final Tune Game of the Decade Edition for Windows PC, find me on Twitter. I'm 108. My DMs are open. Direct message me a photograph of yourself for Windows PC compatible irresistible video game controllers, Xbox One controllers preferred, 4 humans, and some tenuous proof of your identity. I don't know, like your Twitter handle written on a piece of paper. Isn't that what people do? If your DM'd photograph meets all of these criteria, I will reply to you as immediately as possible with a download link. Do not expect a reply if you cannot satisfy all of the criteria. I will make no exceptions. And if you play Video Ball Final Tune Game of the Decade Edition and find yourself liking it enough to desire the full game, which does have online multiplayer, well, that's available on Steam, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. All sales of Video Ball go directly to the publisher and not me, until Video Ball recoups the publisher's investment. That will not happen because of this YouTube video. I've seen the numbers. If you do decide to purchase Video Ball, know that some of the menus are a little bit broken. Game of the Decade Edition, however, leaves all of the menus out. My Video Ball Game of the Decade Edition reveal broke the 400-word average for my game segments, so I'm going to have to call that the second of my 3 wishes. I still have one of my 3 wishes left, so I'm going to plunk down a mulligan and tell you about some games that are not number 1 on my list. I played Spelunky on PC in 2008. I played Minecraft on PC in 2009. I'm sorry, numerology did not work out for these games. I set rules, and my rules are cruel. It was tempting to say No Man's Sky is the game of the decade because it serves as a case study in fans getting wildly angry and developers devotedly evolving a game post-release. The full narrative arc of No Man's Sky feels about as 2010s as anything. I thought about it for about 30 seconds and then decided the whole concept was a little too microscopy, even for me. The Last of Us is not number 1 on this list because while it luxuriously, minutely refined the very idea of a AAA single-player action-adventure video game, games like God of War 2018 show us that its work is not done. And now, the number 1 game that is not number 1 on my list of the Games of the Decade 2010s edition, Death Stranding. Hideo Kojima announced Death Stranding in June of 2016 and released it in November of 2019. Conversation about Death Stranding loomed over the video game likers' pastime for the majority portion of the back half of this decade. For the front half of this decade, we can only presume that Hideo Kojima was taking notes. Furthermore, the game itself feels suspiciously like a mixtape of the 2010s in video game design and culture. Death Stranding had a massive social media leveraging hype cycle, community elements, asynchronous multiplayer, a shockingly open world, hilarious stream fail potential, jangling loose, jagged physics befitting an early access Steam game, a labyrinthine plot that insinuates social media is killing us, comically baroque survival mechanics befitting an early access Steam game. Furthermore, Death Stranding arrived auspiciously right in time for critics considering the close of the decade. I'm only gonna say this once. I do not like falling for stuff. I say you peeking around that corner, Kojima. I say you wanting my precious prize. Well, guess what, buddy? You ain't getting it. Kojima, let me put this politely. Heed my enunciation. Yes, more than any other game on this list, Death Stranding is a game of the decade. However, it is not the game of the decade. Because the game of the decade is Dark Souls. Since right around the time Dark Souls began existing, blog and video commenters began attacking critics for comparing any other game to Dark Souls. The urge to compare a game to Dark Souls lurks primal at the heart of any video game aficionado. To explain simply, Dark Souls contains modernized defamiliarizations of many molecular and atomic essences of video game design theory. Dark Souls' design stretches shadowy tentacles back into the past, infecting our memories of the old times. Metroid is like Dark Souls. Castlevania is like Dark Souls. Faxanadu is like Dark Souls. Legacy of the Wizard is like Dark Souls. And you know what? Prince of Persia is kind of like Dark Souls. Trickling down Dark Souls' enigmatic bulk we find the lickable condensation of long ago evaporated video game feelings. When I asked Red Bull Esports' golden boy Grand Pooh Bear his favorite game of the decade, he said Spelunky HD. He didn't say Dark Souls, though what he said about Spelunky HD, rhetorically fittingly for this prose, reminded me of Dark Souls. It's incredible in that it's a game where you get better simply by playing it, not leveling up or acquiring items. And each item you do acquire comes with its own disadvantages, along with its benefits. Add in the massive amount of secrets and weird cryptic items, and multiple paths to victory, and you have, in my mind, one of the most perfect video games ever created. I'm so grateful I played Spelunky before starting to speedrun because it taught me patience and learning the mechanics of a game like no other, and those things are deeply important to becoming a great runner. The 2010s was a renaissance decade for speedrunning. We could define speedrunning as the practice of loving a game so much you decide to learn everything about it, which includes every possible way to play it, every possible way to navigate its spaces. What Grand Pooh Bear says about Spelunky, I say about Dark Souls, except for the part about it making me a great runner. I did once run 2 miles in 9 minutes and 58 seconds, though that was before even Demon's Souls came out. I only ran 2 6-minute miles this entire decade. Oh man. When I asked Getting Over It with Bennett Fadi creator Bennett Fadi to tell me about his game of the decade, he had this to say, literally, about Dark Souls. I can't think of another game this decade that caused such a huge and sudden shift in the tastes of game designers worldwide. Out of nowhere, suddenly every game became interested in async multiplayer. Suddenly, every game was steeped in lightly revealed mystery instead of overt lore. Suddenly, every game was indifferent to the player and only lightly tutorialized. That didn't happen because Dark Souls was a huge commercial success. It was a pretty slow burn. It happened because designers were captivated with the game's radical design. We've all heard of game design teams having a Dark Souls mention jar that's something like a swear jar. I'd believe this because people hate when you mention Dark Souls when you're playing any game that's not Dark Souls. I have seen idiots in my stream chat getting actually angry because I mentioned Dark Souls while playing a game that was not Dark Souls. It was Code Vein, which is pretty close to Dark Souls, man. So, declaring Dark Souls the game of the decade feels like the only opportunity I will ever have to avoid snippy comments for simply invoking its name. Perhaps the commenters' knee-jerk reactions hint at the true power of Dark Souls. To play a Souls game is to explore it in depth, to learn every tiny corner. To play a Souls game, you have to equip the patience to put the game before yourself. Playing a Dark Souls game correctly requires psychological mechanics not dissimilar to tender love. To play a Dark Souls game is to enter a romantic relationship with it. These jerky-kneed commenters are simply bristly at the reputation of their former lover. I played Demon's Souls in Japan in 2009. Many players worldwide played it in 2010. I played Dark Souls in 2011, though was unable to delve deeply because of work commitments. I may have dismissed Dark Souls tersely on podcasts between 2011 and the time I finally played it through alone in 2014. If I dismissed it, I probably did so the way one might ill-advisedly play hard to get. I did not have time for it, so I joked about it, so I felt better about not having time for it. I came all the way back around on Dark Souls 5 years ago, and I've stayed there. I've played every FromSoft game since. Each adds a new nuance to the harrowing intimacy of the game's formulas. Yet, Dark Souls, a pure revision of its contractually unrelated immediate predecessor, stands colossus tall as an archetype. I declared the original Gears of War the game of the 2000s. Many mocked my prophetic proclamations, though thinking back on them today, I feel pretty good. I had said that we would feel Gears of War's legacy in renewed heft and slowness in AAA video games. I said we would see new blossoming in linear level design and increased emphasis on encounter design. I said we would see an avalanche of more games built on engines whose names all players knew. Now here in 2019, we've seen the likes of God God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, Death Stranding, and The Last of Us. The most popular game on Earth, Fortnite, uses Unreal Engine 4, an engine whose development was pretty much indirectly paid for by sales of Gears of War, which showcased Unreal Engine 3. I might not have been 100% right, though you've got to admit, I was pretty close. Here at the end of 2019, we have Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, the first game that even internet commenters don't seem afraid of saying is like Dark Souls. I mean, it really is. It's like kindergarten Dark Souls. Thus, I speak my predictive dream for the 2020s. We will have more AAA single-player games with asynchronous multiplayer. We'll see intimacy continue to seep back into level design. It took nearly 10 years between Demon's Souls and Jedi Fallen Order, though now that we're here, soon everything will be so exactly like Dark Souls. Even Zelda. What will the game of the 2020s be? Will it be Cyberpunk 2077, or will it be the Final Fantasy VII Remake? I'm sure of exactly two things here in December of 2019. One is that there is no way all of the parts of the Final Fantasy VII Remake will be released before the end of 2029. The other is that I definitely will not be making another Games of the Decade YouTube video. In 10 years, I will either be 50 years old or I will be dead. And while I'm pretty sure that the next decade will find ample use for the video game critical opinions of a 50-year-old person, I feel strongly that that person will not be me. At any rate, let's not worry about that for the moment. That's at most 10 whole years from now. For today, we need to only focus on one thing, that I was born stupid. However, I will not die hungry. Video games forever, Kotaku.com. While I'm here, I might as well seize this opportunity to hand out the first decennial Bibby Membus Awards. Film of the decade goes to Under the Skin, directed by Jonathan Glazer, starring Scarlett Johansson. Television show of the decade goes to Nathan For You, created by and starring Nathan Fielder. Album of the decade goes to UMA by Wednesday Campanella. Well, that about wraps it up for the first decennial Bibby Membus Awards. See you all next time.